Are you into computer history, and do you enjoy watching movies? If so, this video is all about you. Over the years, I've watched just about every single computer history film I could get my hands on, and I wanted to make this video to share some of my favorites. So, without further ado, let's take a look at my picks for the best movies about the history of the computer industry. This video is made to support Tailvids.com, a free community-driven video site. Stick around at the end to learn more. Okay, so let's start off with a classic. This is the only entry on the list that's not based on real events, but it's too iconic not to include. If you didn't live through the 90s, this is about as close to the aesthetic feel of hacker culture as you're going to get, despite the fact that hacking is nothing like this. Hackers tells the story of a child hacker who was arrested for spreading the first virus. Fast forward a few years and he's back to his old ways. Without spoiling too many details, he makes a bunch of hacker friends, hijinks ensue, and everything works out in the end. It's not an amazing movie, but it's a fun movie. If you're into computers, the VR depictions of hacking are worth the admission alone. This next movie is an interesting one. I remember it showing up on Napster or Kazaa or some other peer-to-peer network back in the day, and having zero context about what it was. I think it might even have been called Hackers 2, which is pretty weird since it has nothing to do with hackers. But anyway, Takedown is a retelling of Kevin Mitnick, the infamous phone phreaker. It hits a lot of the main events of Mitnick's active phreaking days, even if they are fairly dramatized. It stars Skeet Ulrich as Mitnick and Donald Logue as his friend Alex Lowe. From a computer history standpoint, this one isn't amazing, but the cinematography is good and the pacing makes it enjoyable. If you want to watch a movie about hacking before it was really a thing, this one isn't bad. Okay, I cheated a bit on this one because it's not directly tied to the computer industry. That said, when the events of this movie take place, there really wasn't a computer industry. A computer at the time was an actual human who sat at a desk and computed math problems that needed solving. The movie mostly revolves around a group of women who worked for NASA during the Apollo era, trying to successfully put a man on the moon. With the main characters being African American and taking place during the 60s, there's obviously a pretty big social component to the story. As a huge fan of both computers and space, this one was really interesting to me, especially not knowing much about this story from the Apollo program. If you're a fan of both of those respective areas, I think there's a lot you'll enjoy about this one. Facebook. Or is it Meta? Anyway, with the creative combo of Aaron Sorkin and David Fincher, you just know that no matter what, it's going to be a solid film. The general idea behind the social network is to trace the origin and rise of Facebook, which is centered mostly around Mark Zuckerberg, portrayed by Jesse Eisenberg. The film does a pretty good job of staying more or less impartial and just portraying events as well as we'll likely ever know them to have happened. It's obviously a really well-made film and interesting to watch. The only negative is that with only 5 to 6 years of material for them to draw on, Facebook's story was still really being written when this was made. And considering everything that's happened with Facebook since then, I'd love to see a follow-up from the same crew. Microman is a movie that really came out of the blue for me. Maybe that isn't a surprise because the events happened when I was still really young, and they mostly took place on a different continent. The movie's about the competition between the Acorn and the ZX Spectrum computers to take the spot as the BBC Micro, and it really centers around the competing egos of the two founders that were involved, Chris Curry and legendary computer pioneer Clive Sinclair. It's a really interesting story about two footnotes in the history of personal computers, and if you don't know much about these computers, it's a great way to get exposed. It was made by the BBC and stars Martin Freeman, so that alone is worth it in my opinion. It actually reminds me a little bit of another movie that we're going to talk about in a minute. But before we get to that, let's talk about The Imitation Game. Benedict Cumberbatch is the main actor in this one, and he always does a great job, and this one's no exception. The story's about Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician who essentially formalized the entire field of computer science. This movie is kind of similar to Hidden Figures in that it's a historical drama that covers what at the time were some pretty controversial social issues. A lot of people have heard of Turing's name through the Turing test, but don't know much else about him. So if you fall into that category, this is a great one to watch. As a warning, it has a bit of a slower pace than some of the other films on this list, so make sure you're comfortable before kicking it on. And finally, we reach my personal favorite in the list of computer history films, The Pirates of Silicon Valley. If Microman covered some footnotes in the story of computing history, Pirates of Silicon Valley would cover entire chapters. It's set initially in the late 1970s, and the entire film is told through two different lenses, that of Steve Jobs of Apple and Bill Gates of Microsoft. It covers the rise of both companies and how they eventually came to be pretty fierce competitors in the personal computer space. Interestingly, despite focusing on Gates and Jobs, the entire movie is narrated by their partners, Steve Wozniak and Steve Ballmer. The movie was made in 1999, and because of that, it really misses the entire resurrection of Apple. So similar to The Social Network, this is another one where I'd love to see the original cast get reassembled to create a sequel that finishes the story. Have you seen this? You've seen it, right? If you have, watch it again. If you haven't, well, make that your movie for tonight. There's so much retro, and even if tons of liberties were taken to build a story, it's just an amazing watch. So that's my list of my favorite computer history films. This is a bit of a different type of video than what I usually make, so let me know if you enjoyed it and would enjoy more like it in the future. If you're watching this video on Tilvids, thanks for being awesome and supporting our community. And if you haven't, stop by tilvids.com. We're a video site that's completely supported by community donations, with no ads and no subscriptions. If you're into edutainment videos, you'll definitely find something interesting to watch at tilvids.com. Thanks for watching.